Hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature with C.S. Lewis as our guide. Today, I'm joined by returning champion, Dr. Justin Ariel Bailey. Those who might not remember or who haven't maybe been listening in chronological order, let me just give you a little background on Dr. Bailey. He works at the intersection of Christian theology, culture, and ministry. Having served as a pastor in a number of diverse settings, his work as a professor explores the ways that culture shapes the practice of Christian faith, as well as the ways that the Christian faith enables culture care. He holds a PhD in theology, and his research seeks to bridge gaps between church and academy and the formational spaces where they overlap. He's the host of the In All Things podcast and writes regularly for their online journal. His written work has appeared in Christianity Today, The Banner, Fair Forward, and the Reformed Journal, as well as academic publications such as Christian Scholars Review and the International Journal of Public Theology. He is the author of the book Reimagining Apologetics and Interpreting Your World. Justin, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Daniel.
I am looking forward to our discussion today. You know, when we had you back on, we were near the end of the last battle. We talked a lot about hope and the
Mm-hmm.
idea of, how do we find hope in our own world and how is Lewis showing that? And, we were in the green room recording that episode. You'd mentioned, I've been really excited about George MacDonald. And I had mentioned, it just so happens that's what we're going to be talking about next. And so I knew we had to have you back on here to help Phil and I make sense, and our listeners as well, make sense of George MacDonald. And you've been thinking a lot about him. You just mentioned that you're in a kind of a MacDonald season. Before we even go much further, I'd love to just hear from you. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with George MacDonald.
Yeah, I mean, my relationship with George MacDonald is probably like a lot of lovers of Lewis. I came to MacDonald through Lewis, noting in Lewis's biography the place where he says that George MacDonald's book Phantastes baptized my imagination and my intellect took longer. So yeah, like most people, make a note of that, right? Lewis has such a incredible impact on my faith, on my imagination, on my life. And so, of course, if there's somebody who baptized his imagination, I want to read that book as well. So I went to Phantastes and didn't like it, and thought it's probably because I'm not smart enough. Lewis is always smarter than me, and so he's able to be blessed by something, something else. And then I got Lewis's anthology of George MacDonald, which is usually the next thing that people also do, and yeah, and enjoyed portions of that. That also positioned me to read MacDonald in a particular way as not a very good writer, but a writer who is more of a teacher and has a lot of sort of ideas to say. And I think I probably set MacDonald aside for a little while until I was doing my PhD studies. And yeah, I think all along the line, I've always been trying to get underneath Lewis because I had a particular kind of experience of a shock of revelatory perception, I would call it, of
Mm-hmm.
reading Lewis. And I was always trying to get underneath, sort of like you all are trying to do on this podcast, to understand Owen Barfield and George MacDonald and J.R.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams and some of these other influences on his thought. And so that's what's eventually led me back to MacDonald as I was working on a dissertation about apologetics. That work has been published in my book Reimagining Apologetics. I was kind of working on that on one hand, and on the other hand, I was doing some work on George MacDonald and the imagination, the theology of the imagination. And at some point, I realized that these were the same project, and and so MacDonald became the focus of my dissertation. And I proposed and successfully, had it approved to write a dissertation about George MacDonald and his dependence on Dante,
Mm,
whom he loved. He lectured on so many different English speaking writers, and only one non-English speaking writer, which was Dante. And so that was going
interesting.
to be my original dissertation. And then at some point, I realized that this dissertation was going to take me 10 years to do it justice, or something like that. And so MacDonald became a chapter in a dissertation about the imagination and apologetics. And I sort of, yeah, uh, said I'd like to keep working on MacDonald, but I think it's probably going to be a project that I'll be doing for for several decades rather than something that is a shorter period of time. Yeah, and so now I've kind of picked it back up recently. I'm working on a chapter for Cambridge Companion to MacDonald, since this is the 200-year anniversary of
Yeah,
his
that's right.
birth. Yeah, this year.
Well, tell me a little bit more about McDonald's writing because like you just mentioned, I also when we were beginning the season, I picked up a copy of Lewis's anthology and I went ahead and I read Lewis's preface and I was a little taken aback because in that his exact words are few of his novels are good and none
Mm,
is very good. And yet we know that Lewis calls him his master. He says that Fantastes baptized his imagination, but the idea that his stories aren't very good is something that there feels like there's some tension there. So, could you help
sure.
me and our listeners kind of work through that? Why are his stories so important
Hmm.
if, according to Lewis and even other literary critics, he's not actually a great writer?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, that for most people, Lewis is the gateway to MacDonald, and yet he orients us to read MacDonald a particular way, which is as a spiritual teacher rather than as a literary artist. There's this great quote by John Pennington, who's a MacDonald scholar, that he says that Lewis is simultaneously MacDonald's greatest ally and his greatest albatross. It's
Hmm.
this the best thing that happened to MacDonald was Lewis, because he got all of these people reading him, and the worst thing that happened to MacDonald was Lewis because we read him through this sort of lens. Oh, read him as a teacher, not as a writer. And so I think that's probably the first misconception that has to be dispelled, is that he's not a very good writer. I think Lewis is just wrong about this, or at least one of the things that a friend and MacDonald scholar Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson points out. She says when Lewis is talking about first rate and second rate writers, he's thinking first rate is Shakespeare and Dante and Milton,
Yeah.
and so Lewis himself is not among that company. But I do think you have the problem, perhaps, like I described, of people going to McDonald hoping to have the exact same experience that Lewis had, almost feeling like this kind of shock of revelatory perception. My guess is that most of us probably have that experience of the imagination being baptized reading Lewis, that Lewis had reading McDonald.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, but I have found that McDonald is kind of like an acquired taste, maybe. He is not a person that I think, other than with a few exceptions, like his children's literature, that grabs you immediately. It's more of like non-representational artist who you are attracted to it, but you're not quite sure why you're attracted to it. And then the longer you spend time with it, the more you feel yourself kind of being transformed by it. I know of no writer, and Lewis said a similar thing, but I know of no writer who personally convicts me towards holiness and piety than MacDonald. I mean, including John Calvin and other people that I love, which also means I can't lose myself in MacDonald in the same way that I can lose myself in Lewis. There is a severity and a gravity in MacDonald that I can only read a little bit at a time, I find. Okay, so that's the first thing I'd say, just as far as the writing. I think that it's an acquired taste, and you have to just spend a lot of time reading and rereading McDonald to really
Hmm.
appreciate um, his craft, which again is maybe an acquired taste for some people. And I have no problem with people liking Lewis more than McDonald. I think Lewis has a much crisper grasp of metaphor and other things like that of story than McDonald does. Um, but I think you really can't understand Lewis without McDonald. Michael Ward says, if you don't, how does he say it? If you don't know George, then you don't know Jack.
Oh, yeah, I love
and
that. Yeah.
and it struck me when I was recently rereading Mere Christianity, which I read with students almost every year. Yeah, just how much of Mere Christianity is in McDonald first. One of the chapter that he quotes him twice, counting the cost, is basically a paraphrase of McDonald, the whole chapter, and he actually explicitly quotes him twice, which he doesn't do very often in Mere Christianity.
That's
He
right.
names him twice. And the rest of the chapter is really just him paraphrasing. You can find the trilemma in MacDonald in Miracles of Our Lord before you find it in Lewis. You can find things in Annals of the Quiet Neighborhood in MacDonald. So Lewis read MacDonald so deeply, and oftentimes he feels such a debt to him in the same way that maybe I would feel to like my doctoral advisor.
Yeah.
feeling like I'm constantly thinking his thoughts, kind of presenting his work, so to speak. I think that's what Lewis, um, yeah, Lewis really did. I mean, obviously, if you read The Great Divorce, you know that it's MacDonald who is his Virgil
Hmm.
for that journey. Or I think maybe if you've read On Stories, you find much of that work in MacDonald's imagination, as his seminal imagination, its function and culture, or the fantastic imagination. That much of the much of what MacDonald writes in those two essays, you will then find in Lewis's On Stories or Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. So there is an incredible debt that these more contemporary writers, the Inklings, have to MacDonald directly. And then the last thing I'll just say is I think MacDonald is a little bit more like Chesterton in his writing. He wrote so much, and so he was not as careful as people who take a really long time to write a book and want every word to be exactly right. And Chesterton regarded MacDonald as one of the most significant thinkers in English literary history. And
Hmm.
he's either wrong about that or he's going to be shown to be right about that. We'll see. In any case, MacDonald is the grandfather, not just of the Inklings, but of the modern fantasy genre. And so there's all sorts of reasons why MacDonald is significant for understanding the Inklings and C.S. Lewis in particular, but even beyond that. And there is, I think, a bit of hope among MacDonald scholars that we're going to see an increasing resurgence of interest in MacDonald's writing.
That's interesting. And you, in the midst of that great, response and helping us think through and understand him better, you alluded to some of his theology and some of his work and the ways it influenced Lewis, not just as a writer of fantasy like Narnia or even The Great Divorce or something, but even in mere Christianity. When I was growing up and I'd heard, Lewis make allusions to MacDonald. I didn't know much about him. I had kind of heard this rumor that he just hated Calvinism and rejected it, and then was somehow fired from his church because of it, or
Mhm.
because he was a universalist,
Mhm.
which was worrisome, and all these things. And so, it was hard for me as we were getting into this to kind of make sense of all these things, because unlike Lewis, unlike Tolkien, there aren't just biographies and biographies and biographies of MacDonald available. There absolutely are some out there. There's even
Right.
people like you who are writing about him, but not to the same extent where I could probably, go to the library and find a biography on Lewis at just my local library down the block here.
Yeah.
Help me understand a little bit of, I know this is a very broad question, so maybe let's narrow it a little bit by simply asking you, MacDonald doesn't begin as a writer. Is that correct? He begins as a pastor.
Mhm. Yep.
So what keeps him, or what happens in this pastoral ministry that has him kind of lead that, at least in a more formalized sense? I understand that he did do a lot of preaching throughout his entire life,
That's
but
right.
did not actually shepherd one particular church. Why is that, and what's going on in his mind? What is his theology a little bit like?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the fact of having so many biographies of Lewis and only a few of MacDonald relative to each other. And one of the problems when you have a limited number of sources is that, one story gets told about a person that then becomes locked in as the primary thing that people know, and then that sort of just multiplies, right? And then the work of scholars is really to kind of go in and question
Hmm.
the misconceptions. And so a second great misconception that people have about MacDonald is that he's sort of this failed pastor who is forced to write because you know he wants to be a pastor, but no one will let him be a pastor. And his novels aren't very good because what he really wants to do is is to preach, and so he
Yeah.
preaches through his novels. But if anybody would have had him, he would have just been a pastor, and it's really not the case. In fact, it's the opposite that's the case. MacDonald is really kind of a polymath who is primarily an academic lecturer and instructor and writer. He's able to write in all genres, on all lecture on all sorts of subjects. Although all while also hosting this really vibrant, like almost like Labrie like um, household, for all sorts of friends and literary lights and things like that. And so he did have a failed pastorate, which we'll talk about in a moment. But like as you said, he did keep preaching for the rest of his life. Never for pay again. He was very intentional that he never wanted to be paid for his preaching,
Interesting.
because he didn't want to feel like he couldn't say anything that he wanted to say. And then he also was a pastoral mentor to many people for the rest of his life. But what happened earlier in his life, I mean, he originally had started out wanting to be a chemist, and then as he sort of just the more he fell in love with Jesus and went deeper into his faith, he felt called to the pastorate. Although others thought that maybe he should be a literary lecturer, which he ended up doing. But he did try to be a pastor at a place called Arundel, a congregational church, Trinity Church, in Arundel for 2 years. And there are many in the church who really enjoyed his preaching, and then there were those who didn't, especially among the leadership of the church. Now, this church probably had some problems. They had fired the two pastors immediately before MacDonald, and they had shorter tenures than MacDonald did. And so that sort of suggests that it's not just MacDonald that
Hmm.
is the reason why this doesn't work out. They tried to cut his salary at least twice, I think. And at one point they said, well, we're going to cut your salary, so you probably don't want to stick around anymore. But he said, no, I feel called to be here. So he took the half salary for a little while, but eventually kind of decided that it was best for everybody for him to move on. So he resigned from that post. The official reason why they said that they let him go was what they called German theology.
Hmm.
And that was sort of like calling somebody woke today, I guess,
Oh, interesting.
just I mean, he was certainly interested in German Romanticism and influenced by it. He had published his translation of Novalis's spiritual songs, and so was very conversant with German Romanticism, though by no means was it the primary or only source of his thinking, any more than that would have been the case for Coleridge or someone like that. But he did hold views that made people nervous. A more expansive view of the love of God. Universalism is kind of a fraught title. Yeah, maybe we could say he was a hopeful universalist. Um, certainly had a broader view of salvation, uh, but also a more severe view of salvation, which I could talk about if you want. In which yeah, every single part of us has to be set free in order for us to be with God, and until that happens, we experience some measure of hell. So it's almost like most people actually go to hell, but it's sort of an empty set at the end, because hell is purgative rather than permanent. Um, but this gets developed over the course of his life. It is pretty unlikely that he had developed all his thoughts on heaven and hell at that church in Arundel.
That early in his career.
Yeah, yeah. He also hoped or thought that animals would have a share in the age to come. So if you've read that part of Problem of Pain in Lewis,
That's right. Yeah.
where Lewis talks about that hope that he has, that also is drawing on MacDonald as well. Who had horses that he loved and thought that they also would be resurrected in the age to come. So you can imagine there was not no reason for him to be kind of persecuted by the leadership of
Yeah.
the congregation, but yeah, it probably wasn't just because he was this kind of crazy heretic in
Hmm.
the midst of everything else. So then he did leave the ministry and he began his writing career as a poet, and then that's how he first came to literary prominence. They knew him as George MacDonald the poet, and it was successful publishing successful volumes of poetry that actually led to him getting a patron who was actually Lady Byron, the widow
Oh,
of
wow.
Lord Byron.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she was the one who sort of enabled him to fully kind of launch into this writing career.
Oh, this is so interesting. I had no idea about this. Let's step back for a moment. Tell me a little bit more about some of his theology, because what's interesting is, as Phil and I were reading through Lewis, many of our listeners as well too, and many just, readers of Lewis's corpus, they might be familiar with Narnia, or maybe they read that first or something, but it's
Mhm.
actually pretty easy to know what Lewis thinks about a lot of things. Now, there's some things that are still a little confusing, but he writes so much. We have his letters, we have all these things, and so we can actually see in Narnia or in The Great Divorce, in the Screwtape Letters, this other kind of theological belief that Lewis might have over here, we can actually really easily make the connection between, okay, he believed this, and that's why we have this. Lewis
Yeah.
is developing throughout his entire lifetime views on purgation, right? Makes sense in light of The Great Divorce.
Hmm.
But for MacDonald, these just aren't as well known. So just taking a step back into his theology, you said he had a more broad view. This is not like universalism as I understand it, as a kind of all paths lead to heaven. God, Jesus is just one of many gods. This is not what he's necessarily
No, not at
saying.
all.
It would maybe would it be a better phrase to call it like a form of Christian
Yeah,
universalism?
for sure.
Can you help us understand that
Yeah,
just a little bit more?
and even that, I mean, there is a bit of debate among McDonald scholars as to that term, which is why I sort of was resistant to it.
Yeah, sorry.
I
I
think
said
it's
it, not you. Let the
no,
record
I think
show
it's probably
Daniel said it.
fair. I think it's probably the right term. Um, in terms of what McDonald actually hopes. He does entertain the possibility of annihilationism.
Mhm.
So the basic idea is that God is a consuming fire of love, and He's revealed Himself in Jesus Christ. So God has created every human being as His image bearer and as His child. And since they are His child, though they've been estranged from Him by sin, He will stop at nothing until all of them are back in His house. And that means that he will go through the most extreme of measures in order to gather them back into the house, using every single thing, both good and painful, in order to draw them ultimately to let go of themselves and to grasp onto to him and his love. And so, if you sort of think about what McDonald is interested in, is not even giving us the right answer, but pointing us in the right direction, which is always towards God and away from this sort of obsession with ourselves. So this thing that I think Lewis quotes, that the one rule of hell is "I am my own." That's first found in MacDonald in his sermons. That idea of like Gollum belonging to myself
Oh,
alone,
sure. Yeah.
and this idea of that you see in the Great Divorce of getting further and further and further away from God and from heaven and from each other. And that's the experience of hell, that experience of alienation. But that God is even meaning to use that to bring a person to the end of themselves so that they will then turn around and come back towards the light and experience the purgation or the purification of moving towards the center, which is the love of God. So again, it's a pretty robust and even severe account of what it takes for a person to be in God's presence.
Mhm.
It requires a complete sort of purification of releasing yourself and um, and entering into the love of God. Because God is not, Lewis quotes this in that chapter of Mere Christianity. God is easy to please, but hard to satisfy, um, because God's not satisfied until He has brought everyone back to into His house, into the house of the Father.
Yeah.
So MacDonald knows that in some sense he is. I mean, he certainly knows that he's going against sort of the received wisdom. It's one of the things that he does oppose in Calvinism. Although, of course, there has always been a form of Christian universalism that's grown in Calvinist gardens, we might say, and he is in some ways a deeply Calvinian thinker, um, and he kind of takes grace like sort of to the nth degree,
Mhm.
and refuses to put any limit on. Yeah, the fact that God elects some but not others. He would say God elects some to be first so that they might bring blessing to the rest, sort of like with Israel God chooses
Oh,
first
interesting.
so
Okay.
that Israel may bring the Gentiles in. And so similar, he'd say that, yeah, there are elect, but they're elect so that they may also bring others in. So yeah, he does entertain the possibility of something like annihilationism, that if a person were to get so far and refuse to turn, that they would in some sense almost like lose the image of God, or lose, like, to use an image from Lewis, like when Ginger the cat loses the ability to speak.
Speak, yes.
Yeah, like they lose that sort of ability, and then at that point they just sort of go out of existence. um, but he also simultaneously resists that possibility, because he thinks that ultimately God's God's love is not satisfied, and His justice also is not satisfied until He has won back um, His intention, every person um, as the person He intended. And so He has almost this kind of image of we talk about like the old man and the new man, or the true self and the false self. That there is a sense in which the old man or the false self is consumed eternally in hell, but you yourself are saved. So that you that delights in doing sin, that you will rejoice as you see it consumed eternally in the fire, as the real you, the you that God intended, appears, and you receive the white stone with the name on it that only you and God know. And so it's this very, I think, in some ways, challenging vision of sanctification, and so yeah, it's not an easygoing universalism. It's
Yeah,
not at all a yeah, everyone's going to be okay, so don't preach the gospel, or everyone's going to be okay, so don't try to be holy, because it very much says, like, no, it requires you sort of submitting to um, the the consuming fire, until all that is false in you is is cleansed.
from my understanding, just to maybe wrap up this question, a lot of that kind of view of maybe like modern universalism is founded much more in modern postmodern thought, whereas as you're explaining this, I'm thinking of Gregory of Nyssa and
Yeah,
some of his
that's
early
right.
writings on universal salvation, which are not quite the same, but they have some similarities. And so MacDonald in this is appearing to look back to the early church and is not necessarily being influenced by the more modern idea. I'm sure is there too. You mentioned his Germanic
Mhm.
views and these things too, Germanic
Yeah,
romanticism. I mean, but there's that, I think, for us, is for me at least, is a helpful to understand, because when I hear universalism, I think of one thing. And while his idea, I think, seems to be, it's something that is certainly not part of the normal Orthodox view of, lowercase o, Orthodox view, as the church has, the universal church has maybe understood it. It's also not this thing that's completely outside the bounds
that's
of
right. Yeah,
what we understand. Okay, that's
yeah,
super helpful.
and I'll just also say I can't follow him all the way on his view.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and challenging to me, and I don't feel like I can follow him all the way though on it. And in some case, perhaps McDonald is simply able to imagine and hope more than I can. I sort of feel like there's some problems with that view, and scripturally, or just even logically, or at least questions I'd love to ask him about it if he were still with us. But there is something about it that is certainly, it's not unprecedented. There's certainly within the Eastern Church lots of precedent for it. And in general, McDonald is kind of interesting in that way, that almost always, like, he intuitively goes in the direction of the Eastern Church rather than the Latin Church, and has sensibilities that map on much more closely to Eastern Orthodoxy, though he doesn't really signal to any kind of particular influences of it.
Yeah.
A lot of the conclusions he comes to are similar to some of the conclusions that you find in the Eastern Church.
Well, as we're talking about his view of God's love, one of the things that I have found interesting is I've been reading a little bit of biographies on the side and then reading through The Princess and the Goblin right now. That before MacDonald, Phil and I spent almost a decade reading and rereading, the Chronicles of Narnia, but just a ton of Lewis. I mean, I probably 50% of the reading I've done in the last 10 years has probably been either about Lewis or actually on Lewis, which is a lot for one
Yeah,
particular person. And what's interesting is all of Lewis's actual writing occurs, almost all, the vast majority, not all, but almost all of it occurs while he is a bachelor. And all of it obviously occurs without him being a father, right? And at least, I guess, till the very end, when he marries Joy, and then he does have stepchildren.
yeah.
But MacDonald had 11 kids.
Hmm.
And as I was reading through some of his biographies, his relationship to his children is something that's so wonderful. I mean, the way in which you talk about this kind of Labrie attitude in his household. It's not just with friends
Yeah.
and people down the road and all. It's like his own kids,
Yeah.
right? Like it was. I mean, you got a family of 13. It's not too hard to do that, and it was a family that was full of so much love, and you see that in MacDonald. And yet there was also lots of tragedy, lots of illness in his
Hmm.
family. MacDonald obviously suffered himself
Hmm.
from some lung issues, some other physical things, but I think like two or three of like close family members, his own kids died of tuberculosis. I mean, he
That's
had a
right.
lot of death, and yet the love of God is there.
Hmm.
But I would love for you to help me understand, in what ways are his stories conveying this love of God as our Father? We see that his theology, again, it's not something that's being pushed by this kind of more like modern idea of, oh, I just want everybody to be happy, but it literally seems to be a robust, as you explained, view of who God is.
Hmm.
As think about like God is love, or the Father's
Yeah.
love. How does that make its way into his stories?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, the um, fatherhood is at the core of the world. That's what McDonald would say, and so Lewis talks about McDonald having a near perfect relationship with his own father, which you can really see borne out over the course of letters. It felt like they could really talk about anything, in their letters with each other. And then, as you mentioned, yeah, McDonald's children also had this wonderful, they testified to this wonderful relationship that they had with their father, and the respect for him, even though he certainly wasn't perfect. I think of Greville, sort of talking about how his dad wanted to kind of homeschool him or something like that, if that makes sense. But he didn't really learn to read because they were always doing other things. So he wasn't perfect in everything that he did by any stretch of the imagination. And yet multiple of McDonald's children said that he's the holiest man that they've ever met. But you sort of think about, I mean, how rare that is for kind of great great men, or great thinkers or writers, to be so famous in their own house, so well spoken of by their own children. So he certainly practiced what he preached, in terms of yeah, fatherhood being at the world's core. Yeah, as you also mentioned, he did experience a lot of tragedy related to his family. His most famous poem, Diary of an Old Soul, which I always tell people, if you're looking for a place to start with MacDonald, it's 365 daily readings it's one long poem, and it's a poem that's written in the aftermath of the death of his adult daughter, um, and with whom he was really close. And so it's certainly not a theology of God's love that's sentimental or that's untouched by deep suffering, but it's an incredibly strong account um, of so strong is his conviction of the fatherly love of God, that he sees every single thing that happens in the world as something intended by God, which kind of leads to almost a really strong difficulties when you come to the problem of evil, which oftentimes are found in Calvinist systems, where you have a really strong account of providence, where
Hmm.
every single thing that happens is ordained by God in some sense. But MacDonald really believed that. MacDonald had this just incredibly strong um, conviction of God's providence, because God is the Father, and as a father, he always is willing the good of his children. And so that means that even my suffering, even the death of my children, God is seeking to meet me and love me in it. Um, so I think it honestly makes me a little bit uncomfortable sometimes when I read how strong his account of providence is. But it certainly was an account that every single thing that happens in my life, or in the world, is not something that takes God by surprise, but is always out of his fatherly hand, his fatherly care, and intended to open my eyes, open my heart, so that I can receive his love and live in it as his son, as his child. And so Jesus is absolutely critical to this, because we have forgotten what it means to be God's children. We have turned away from the Father. And so Jesus comes to restore to us um, the imagination of children, to help us see the world as he does. And that the primary thing that Jesus says is, my Father is just like me. And so against kind of what he saw as really toxic and destructive views of God that saw him as an authoritarian or saw him as, in his sovereignty, sort of ruling the world with a cold and brutal hand. He would say, "Brothers, have you seen our king? There he is, kissing little children and saying they are like God." Emphasizing the way that God comes to us in weakness and in suffering, and opens our hearts to receive the world the way He intended to receive it. So yeah, and I think he also has a really Trinitarian theology. There's some debate among MacDonald scholars about that as well, because he doesn't use the word Holy Spirit very often, and he doesn't use the word Trinity very often. But I think you can see
Hmm.
pretty clearly in the structure of his writing, this kind of Trinitarian shape that the Spirit, fills our hearts and shapes us to be able to receive God's love.
This picture you've given us of so many great men that
Mhm.
we look up to, that we study, that we think about through both history, but even just in our own lives, I can think of where, and I see this especially as a teacher. I see this especially as a teacher, where I see great fathers who were doing many great things out in the world, and even for the gospel, right? For
Right.
spreading Christ's love, and yet there's some disarray in the home, or there is some. It's by no means neglect that's going on, but it's a maybe prioritizing of spreading the gospel outside of the home over spreading it and making
Mhm.
sure it's cultivated and flourishes inside the home.
Mhm.
And I think, in our modern world, there's a lot of a tendency. I feel this tendency myself, right? One of the things that my wife and I always have to remind ourselves, and she's much better at this than I am, is, as, and you would know this as well too, as a teacher, as a professor, is I sometimes have to remember, as much as I love the students and care for them in my class, they're my students temporarily, whereas my
Mhm.
children are like they're here. It's much
Yeah.
longer than just a year or so, or just a class or so. And McDonald, I think, can be such a great exemplar of what this looks like in the home in caring for your children. And I think what I love so much about some of his stories as I'm reading more is hearing how so many of them, and we see this with like Tolkien as well too, came out of just conversations with his own kids, right?
Mhm.
For some of this happened with Lewis Carroll as well too, and again, they were friends. McDonald and Carroll knew each other. Where some of the stories
Mhm.
given
Yeah.
to young kids out of that is where these imaginative worlds come from. One question I have for you, maybe to wrap up our time together, moving away just from some of his beliefs, some of his theology, would be to these actual stories themselves. Lewis kind of has three particular, and again, the boundaries here they're a little blurry, but kind of three particular parts of his career. You have Lewis's academic work, you have his fantasy kind of fictional work, and then you have his kind of apologetics, his nonfiction work. And you can
Mhm.
put most of his books will fit somewhere. Some are a little bit trickier, like The Great Divorce is it's fictional, but it's certainly got some apologetic work going on. But you can fit a lot of his books into these three categories. Can you help me understand McDonald's work as a writer? You said he's done some poetry. Obviously,
Yeah.
he has his children's books. You've got Lilith, you've got Fantastes, the Princess and Curdie stories, but he also has a considerable amount of just kind of what we would call in like the elementary school, like realistic fiction as well
Yep.
too.
Yep.
Help me understand, what kind of books is he writing, and which ones for him were there ones he was more focused on? Were there ones that he was? Help me
Mhm.
understand his books.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about his output, you're thinking 50 or 60 volumes published. And then, like I said, like he did a ton of lecturing, and we're sort of part of the scholarly work is recovering some notes and things like that, because he always would lecture without notes, for hours at a time. And so yeah, that maybe some of that is just lost to history. But yeah, I think that you could probably divide it similarly as you've done. You have McDonald's poetry, which is how he started out and continued throughout his career, but it's probably the thing he's least known for. And then you have his fantastic work, which his career is sort of bookended by two major fantastic works: the Fantastes, sort of at the beginning, 1858, and then Lilith, which is in some ways his magnum opus. Also, I'd say probably the most difficult and the most rewarding book of his to read. And maybe some of his most mature thought, but also it's just so complex. I mean, you could probably read it 30 times and not quite get it. which is okay because it's kind of one of those things that just keeps giving to you, I think. But it's not straightforward in any any sense of the imagination, and yet it has these really beautiful scenes, like the scene of Lilith, who has her hand is sort of frozen shut, like the entire story, because she cannot open it to receive, open it,
Hmm.
to let go. And there's all of these just images that are so powerful, and the way he writes the end of that story and talks about Jesus as the the beautifulest man, the most beautiful man, and it's just beautiful. So I would say take a shot at Lilith, even though it'll be pretty difficult. And then you have the children's stories, right? Which I always tell people that's the place to begin. Princess and the Goblin, absolutely the place to begin. Princess and Curdie, The Light Princess, The Golden Key, Little Fairy Tale. Which there's one that's come out beautifully illustrated, of that. And so I'd say that that would be the place that almost always I tell people to start. He has written something like 30 realistic novels, in quotes, because all of these realistic novels also have kind of this kind of fairy tale like flavor to them. You have themes of um, a baron's son who doesn't know who he is, and he's working on the estate and he ends up inheriting the estate, that sort of thing. You have
Sure.
love stories, almost like princesses and things like that, but all set in very kind of ordinary locations, oftentimes with very ideal characters like Christ figures, figures that are sometimes almost too perfect, we might say, in our sense, because of their holiness. And some of those are known as his English novels, where they're written just in English as we would read them. But then others are known as his Scottish novels because they're characterized by quite a bit of Scots dialect, Doric Scottish dialect, and so hard to understand sometimes what
I'm
is actually
sure.
being said.
Yeah.
There's kind of dual versions now that have come out where the dialect is on one side and there's a paraphrase on the other side. Or I always say a lot of times LibriVox has people who have recorded it. And if you listen to it, you can sort of hear it better than if you're just trying to read it. So those would be the primary divisions in his work. I mean, he also did a lot of literary criticism and he wrote some plays and things like that. But those would be the um, primary. Oh, and sermons. He has 5 volumes of sermons, which, if you're wanting to understand kind of his theology formally, he has 3 volumes of unspoken sermons, and then he has Miracles of Our Lord and Hope of the Gospel.
Okay. And then there's also the unspoken sermons is there as well too?
Yeah, yeah. So there's 3 volumes of those of
Okay.
unspoken sermons. Yeah.
Were these when they're called unspoken sermons, are they ones he didn't actually he wrote but didn't share
There's
or
some there's some debate over that, actually, and there are some that say it's unspoken because he never actually presented them, and then others say that there's a good indication that they represent, because he spoke without notes most of the time,
Mhm.
that they represent his kind of writing down of what his normal kind of sermons would have been.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, it's kind of hard to tell.
Well, there is so much to dive into here with McDonald. You've given us such a, it's hard to sum up, and we're not trying to sum up someone's entire life and their work. But I feel like after just, a little bit of time together, and I know many of our listeners have such a better understanding of who this man was and his work and his thought. And so I'm so thankful, Justin, for your ability to help walk us through this. And, this is something I've seen as, knowing you now over a little bit of time and hearing you speak and reading some of your writing that you do so well. And so before we let you go, I just would love for you to be able to share a couple places where people can find your work, your podcast, your books, because I think you have such a God-given gift to be able to help us, as you literally call one of your books, interpret the world around us, right? In a place where you're making sense of these big theological things, but doing it in a way that is um, easy to understand, that feels maybe more relevant, because sometimes we have a harder time going back further in time, right? Some of us do. And it, I think that this is something that you just have such a knack for. And I'm so thankful that the Lord's given you this gift. Where can people find more about these
Mhm.
things?
Yeah, well, thanks again. Thanks so much for your kind words on that. So my website is P Justin, so like Professor Justin, pjustin.com. Um, I think it's .com. Is it .com or .org? It must be .com. If you just type in my name, Justin Ariel Bailey, it'll pull up that website, and that has my books and some things I've written. And yeah, you can find me on most social media channels. I've just turned in. Well, actually, I'm about to turn in a manuscript for a third book called "Discipling the Diseased Imagination,"
All right.
which sort of starts with Eustace the dragon, and the whole idea
Great.
of dragons. So I'm not sure if that'll be out in 2025. If it is, it'll be the end of 2025, beginning of 2026, when it comes out.
Well, that's really exciting. That's awesome. And also just a plug for your podcast as well too. I'm a listener. I love it. It's great. You do a lot of interviewing of writers and especially focusing, and speakers, theologians,
Hmm.
professors, especially focusing often on kind of one particular idea instead of like
Yeah.
finding one person and just, hey, tell us about all the work you do. It's like,
Yeah.
tell us about this one particular idea. And it's helped really made sense of the world that we're living in. And so I can't recommend it enough. And it's usually like, I want to say a little under an hour or so. It's not even,
Yep.
it's not a long podcast. You can, you did one of my favorite episodes you did was, with Dr. Favali, Abigail Favali, and the Genesis of
Yeah.
Gender. Just
Yeah.
a really important book, and but also quite dense.
Oh, I'm so happy. I'm so happy that it's helpful. I sort of think of the podcast as me curating a reading list for people of
Hmm.
books I think that people should be aware of. Read if they can. If not, I'm trying to get at the heart of the most important ideas in those books in that limited amount of time. So yeah, it's always really encouraging to know that someone's found it helpful.
Yeah, they have. All right. Well, thanks again, Dr. Bailey, for being on the show. So thankful for the work that you do, and looking forward to this new book, potentially in the next year or the year after that. As always, I do want to thank our patrons over at patreon.com for making this episode possible. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks always goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Andrew Trophy, Becca Brown, Christiana Line, and Ian Wooten for supporting us at our top tiers. You can find links to past guests, reference books, and other things over at lamppostlistener.com. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back soon.